ברוכים הבאים לשומר סף, and this episode is going to be in English. אז אם אתם שומעים אותנו בפודקאסט, אז תעברו לוידאו ושם יהיו כתוביות אם יוצא השם. And on this episode, we are saying hi to two people, Mike Dooran from the Hudson Institute and Tony Bdran, Tony, from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Hi to you both, and Mike, why don't you introduce Tony as you know him so well?
Hi, Gadi, thank you. So Tony is a very good friend of mine. I've known him for years, decades, actually. Tony is a research fellow at FDD, that's the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and he focuses on Lebanon, Hezbollah, and Syria, and the geopolitics of the Levant. I'm not sure where the Levant is, but I think you guys are in it. But I consider Tony to be the number one analyst of Arab politics in general. I don't know anybody smarter. Seriously, I talk to him all the time. Been enormously influenced by everything he thinks. He's an extremely annoying person, but if you get past that, if you get past the annoyance, he's extremely intelligent, and it's always good to talk to him. But I wanted him to come talk to you today because he's got very strong views. Also, Tony, if you don't mind me saying this, Tony is the most un-Lebanese person you've ever met. I mean, he's immigrated to America. He has an American passport, but Tony does not have the ability to dissimulate or to bob and weave. So Tony figures out what he thinks, and then he tells you.
Tony, you look pained.
Yeah, you do look really pained.
I'm waiting for the introduction to be over.
To be over.
Yeah. No, it's going to go on for a while. Anyway, okay, I'll stop. But he, he's extremely intelligent, figures out what he thinks, and then he says it. Now, he's got very strong views about the American initiative that the Israelis have bought into on some level to demarcate the maritime border with Lebanon. And I think that your viewers especially, Gadi, will benefit from hearing what Tony has to say about this. I may add a few words myself as we go along, but I really want to showcase his views.
So, Tony, give us an introduction to where things are now with these.
I thought you were going to say, give us an introduction to Mike. So we'll just spend the show giving mutual introductions. No, I mean, in serious, thank you, Mike. It was very flattering. I appreciate it. And thank you, Gadi, for having me on your great show. Sure. I've enjoyed your previous conversations, including
thank you.
With the most recent one with Mike. Just for the sake of introducing for those who don't know, which I suspect are not going to be many among your audience, what Israel and Lebanon have begun negotiations to demarcate their maritime border. Just the other day, they started the first session. Another session is scheduled for October 28th. There's a dispute between Israel and Lebanon over where their maritime border lies, and that has an impact on their exclusive economic zones, where both have fields for gas, for offshore gas, and obviously Israel has developed those. It's ahead in developing them. Lebanon is still in the exploration phase, but it has signed a deal with a consortium of 3 companies led by the French Total and the Italian Eni and the Russian Novatek. Total and Eni have 40% each. Novatek has 20% in the consortium.
Let me show the map so viewers can visualize it. So this darker area is the disputed area, and it's like there's a disagreement on the angle of the border on the shore side. So, and how to project it into the sea, right? This is
correct. So Lebanon initially had done a bilateral agreement with Cyprus in which it said that the point where now Israel claims its border was its provisional southernmost point of its zone. Israel then proceeded to sign a deal of its own with Cyprus, adopting what Lebanon and Cyprus had agreed to. Now, the difference is that Cyprus ratified the agreement. Lebanon did not ratify the agreement with Cyprus. So then Israel and Cyprus proceeded to demarcate their own economic maritime borders based on Cyprus's agreement with Lebanon. Lebanon then proceeded to change its mind and said that the southernmost tip, which it had agreed with Cyprus about, was actually about 17 kilometers north of where it should be. And the discrepancy creates this triangle that you showed in the map, which is about 860 square kilometers, which is a disputed area. Now, as you can see, the Israeli fields, and there are a couple more that are not on this map. So there is more up north of Tamar. So there's Karish and the Alon D right there, right where you're showing. Yeah. But they don't cross into the disputed zone. They are well within Israel's waters. And you see Block 9 in yellow on the Lebanese side. That's where the consortium of Total, Eni, and Novatek is set to drill. Now, a small part of Block 9 crosses into the disputed area, I believe. But regardless, the fact that this has been a disputed area has stalled the consortium's ability to begin operations in Lebanon. So whereas Israel has been able, because its fields are further south, to start developing them, to extract gas, to get them online, and more importantly, to find an export market for them, Lebanon has not. Now, all of a sudden, because Lebanon's economy has collapsed, the Lebanese once again have renewed interest in getting an agreement. Of course, as it happens, that it comes at a time when a lot of Lebanese political figures are getting sanctioned, and it's also at a time right before we hit the election in the United States. So it's a convenient time for the Lebanese to do so, especially as the French have taken a tremendous political interest in Lebanon recently after the explosion at the Beirut port. And they are leading an effort to invest politically and financially in Lebanon. And the United States sort of inexplicably has decided to take this moment to begin this process. So to my mind, to put sort of the bottom line up front, to my mind, the US initiative and the amount of political capital that has been spent on it is completely unjustified and ill-timed, and also has the potential to undercut the US position vis-a-vis Hezbollah and Lebanon, and in fact, maybe even a little bit beyond that, should this initiative proceed proceed forward. So it could undercut the United States, important achievements for the United States.
Because it lets Hezbollah off the hook while we were just getting it surrounded and suffocated. I mean, America,
right,
with Israel's help.
Right. So I mean, the initiative, as I see it, does not advance any obvious U.S. interests. Its effect for Israel even are actually also marginal. Israel is already exporting gas. It's not and whatever exists near the border with Lebanon are things that are already within its territorial waters. Maybe it affects their ability to explore more near the border, but it doesn't actually alter anything with regard to Israel's energy operations.
The way it's been presented to the Israeli public, to the extent that it was, Israelis are not focused on that right now, is another prospect of peace, what do you know? We had peace with
Right.
the United Arab Emirates. We had peace with
Right.
Bahrain. Now we're going to have peace with Hezbollah. Imagine that. And
Right.
also we would have some agreement with them so that in case of war, they'll respect our drilling rigs and we'll respect theirs. This is how
Correct.
the issue is framed for the readers of Haaretz, say.
Right. So that is a problem. So on the first, for the first point, this was also how it was presented in the United States, and that is a dishonest presentation, because number one, to equate this process with what are in fact actual, real, and historic achievements for the White House in getting Arab states to normalize, not just sign a peace agreement, but to normalize relations with Israel, to equate that with this process in Beirut is to cheapen an actual achievement. So it is because this is not even border demarcation, not even peace, let alone normalization. So to present that way is dishonest.
So we're just helping save Hezbollah? That's what we're doing with all this thing?
So that's what I started to say. It advances no obvious American interest. The impact on Israel is marginal. The upside is entirely on the Lebanese side, entirely. So they get further French investment, political and financial. The first thing the Lebanese did when they announced the framework agreement to begin negotiations was that the Speaker of Parliament, Nabih Berri, Hezbollah's ally, immediately said that he has informed Total that they need to begin drilling before December. So they want Total to immediately start operations so that Total can start investment in Beirut. Of course, this undermines the U.S. position of pressure, but also it undermines the U.S. declared position that somehow it does not want to strengthen this corrupt political order and political class in Lebanon. Meanwhile, the only people who are going to benefit from it are this political class. And one last thing, if I may, it undermines, and this is much more important beyond this optics, is that the United States has been negotiating effectively, indirectly with Hezbollah, because the people who hold the reins of power in Lebanon are Hezbollah. And the United States has been negotiating with Nabih Berri, their ally, even as they start sanctioning people in his own party. And the government, the caretaker government, there's no government in Lebanon now, there's a caretaker government. The caretaker government is a Hezbollah government. So even as the United States goes to the Europeans and hectors them about how they cannot distinguish between Hezbollah's military wing and political wing, and to engage with Hezbollah politically the way the French did, like when the French came to Lebanon, Macron came to Lebanon, met with a designated Hezbollah individual, a sanctioned MP. So we're hectoring them, and Secretary Pompeo wrote an op-ed in a French newspaper denouncing, France's that it's not following suit with the United States in designating Hezbollah. As we do that, at the same time, we're conducting indirect negotiations with Hezbollah to advance no obvious U.S. interest, a marginal Israeli interest, simply, and this is presented officially as such, that we would like for Lebanon to prosper just as we would like for Israel to prosper. And we allied the fact that this is Hezbollah Lebanon that we want to be prosperous.
Mike, so why does the U.S. how did it come to pass? Is this State Department initiative?
Well, we love peace. We love peace. I mean, we are suckers for the Syrians, the Iranians, Hezbollah. They're very good at getting us to trade very real concessions for process on their part. They agree to sit down at the table and talk about something that we love, and in order to get them to the table, we make all kinds of concessions. And in what Tony's saying here, there are a number of concessions. One, we have the maximum pressure campaign against Iran, and one of the great impacts of the maximum pressure campaign was that it was putting Hezbollah under an enormous amount of economic pressure, and we undercut that. As he mentioned, we're also reaching out to the French, Italians, and Russians. right? We're building an economic lobby for Lebanon that is made up of powers that are either hostile to us, like Russia, or have a very different view of the region, like France and Italy. So we're turning them into a lobby. They're going to be there now at every step of the way. Whenever it comes time to do anything with regard to Lebanon, that economic lobby is going to be there to push us to. All of those powers want to knock us off the maximum pressure policy toward Iran. That's what this is. For strategically, I mean, Lebanon doesn't matter that much in the grand scheme of things from American strategy, but Iran does, and Hezbollah is very important within the Iran complex, and we're strengthening, just like the JCPOA did in this little smaller arena. We're strengthening all the elements that want to undermine our larger policy. It doesn't make any sense.
Just to follow up on that, Mike, actually, the first thing when Macron went to Beirut this summer after the blast, the first thing that the Élysée did was to leak to the media that when Macron called President Trump and encouraged him to abandon the policy of pressure in Lebanon because it was hurting the wrong people and it wasn't at all productive. So the only thing that the French are doing in Lebanon is to lobby us to ease up on Lebanon, not because they want to build, let's say, an alternative coalition or whatever. No. Even as they directly engage with Hezbollah to advance their own interests there.
And this is the Hezbollah media, Tony, you should speak to this, but Hezbollah media is spinning this as a victory for Hezbollah because Hezbollah brought America to the table. Not Lebanon, but Hezbollah. And so at the very moment when you have all of the dissent on the streets of Lebanon, all of a very widespread feeling that the entire system is corrupt and it's undergirded by Hezbollah. Hezbollah is basically the master of the political system in Lebanon. People in the United States, and I suspect in Israel too, are saying that, oh, this is a way to undercut Hezbollah because we will set up the funding such that Hezbollah doesn't have control over it and so forth. And therefore, we'll put them under pressure. And Gadi, as you suggested also, well, they'll have a vested interest in their economic project on their side of the border. And so therefore, they won't be interested in any kind of conflict with us because they're going to want to keep the peace in order to get the money. This kind of thinking. If you've ever been closely involved with the Syria or Lebanese or even some of the Iraqi discussions, take, the equivalent in the Israeli context would be the Second Intifada. And imagine, I'm sure that there were lots of Israelis who say Arafat will never engage in the Second Intifada because the economy on the West Bank is exploding and they're doing so well. And if there's violence between Israel and the West Bank, it will undercut the West Bank economy and that will undermine Arafat. So Arafat will never engage in violence. Right? How successful was that logic? Where in the Middle East have we ever seen the United States or Israel build up an economic lobby across the border with hostile actors that actually moderated those actors in some way? I've never seen it happen.
Not in an economic lobby, but in a political cooperation, say as with Jordan, it sometimes helps. It helps.
But Jordan has never really been a hostile actor, not like in the sense of Hezbollah. Yes, Jordan has fought wars with Israel, but there has always been a strong desire on the part of the Jordanian authorities, always, even in the mandate years, to come to an accommodation with Zionism and then Israel. There's never been a desire on the part of Hezbollah or Hamas or Iran to come to such an agreement.
Because there's a convergence of interests in both both can be Israel and Jordan can be undermined by a Palestinian state. So there's always a gap between the rhetoric of the Hashemites and their actual interests. The best thing for them is the continuation of the occupation. That would solve their problems. But I agree, Hezbollah is a completely different actor. So I'll play devil's advocate here, since you two are generally in agreement, and ask if it was presented to the Israeli public, at least partially, or this is the way people talk about it here, as if this may be the beginning of some kind of long-term agreement, because now Hezbollah have, for the first time, kind of recognized Israel without saying its name. So that's all maneuvering cynically, is it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't understand this at all, because Hezbollah has always allowed, for instance, the tripartite committee that was established under Security Council Resolution 1701, which came after the 2006 war, which allowed for a tripartite committee of the Lebanese Armed Forces, the IDF, and UNIFIL to talk to each other, to resolve disputes, and to delineate the blue line. So that has never been an issue. And what happened this time around is the second people were starting to present the participation of non-military officials on the Lebanese delegation in the talks as some form of soft normalization or recognition, Hezbollah immediately came up and said, okay, you know what, we'd rather actually not have civilians. We just want it to be military, so that it doesn't diverge from the existing format of communication. The military brigadier general who heads the Lebanese delegation, who is a close acolyte of Nabih Berri and Amal, Hezbollah's partner, read a statement at the beginning of the meeting, the first meeting, in which he affirmed, number one, that these are indirect talks, right? That we're not talking directly, we're talking through, and the statement, incidentally, was completely scrutinized before he was allowed to read it by Hezbollah, by Berri, by the Lebanese Armed Forces, everyone. Right? So it was a very carefully worded statement. And it's an interesting thing, because the statement leads off, the first paragraph of the statement leads off by saying, we are here to discuss in these indirect negotiations under the aegis under the sponsorship of the UN, which is also a bizarre language because the US is the mediator. And then they put the US second as a facilitating mediator, right? And then they said, we're here to discuss the southern borders. They didn't make a distinction between the maritime border and the land border.
This is very important. I think you should help us understand here the difference, the significance of them, of the Lebanese demanding that the land border be part of this.
So for the longest time, the reason why we haven't been able to get the Lebanese to do this, to sign on to this agreement, since we started in about 2012 under the Obama administration. Fred Hoff first started it, and then Amos Hochstein continued to try to get a deal. And every time, by the way, more concessions were given to the Lebanese, right? And the idea was that from the Lebanese point of view, there were two conditions. Number one, this has to happen under UN sponsorship. Not under, the US can be a facilitator, but this has to be all referenced with the UN, all lodged with the UN. And number two, which of course doesn't work for Israel, and number two is that there has to be a simultaneous demarcation of the land border and the maritime border. Now, this time around, they probably because of, on the one hand, the economic meltdown in Lebanon, the threat of sanctions to try to neutralize this administration a month before they hit the election, and then, we'll see what happens. They conceded, but the way it came out, the framework that we agreed to also conceded some of theirs, but indirectly. So we're both playing this dance now that's going on. The U.S. agreed to U.S. mediation, even though it's under the UN aegis and with the participation of the UN. So there's a UN delegation there. But we agreed to a separate parallel, and we put this in our statement that announced the initiative, that there would be a separate parallel track, not under the US mediation, but separately between Israel, UNIFIL, and Lebanon, to start demarcating their land border as well. So we gave them that cover, and we pulled out from it, and we said, let the UN and Israel and the Lebanese handle it themselves.
But the Lebanese Hezbollah wants the land border in there because because of Sheba farms, because of Har Dov, right? They want to claim that they are fighting against Israel for Lebanese land, Sheba farms, which no American administration should agree to, either directly or indirectly, because the United States has now recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan. Sheba farms belongs to Israel. The United that's American policy. So the United States shouldn't be in the business of reopening the question of the land border. And Hezbollah can now go to its own public, and it can go and say, we got the Americans to reopen the question. Now, whether the Americans are going to say that didn't happen, but why are we even playing this game? Why are we helping them in that way?
That's exactly my question. So that's one of the things I said at the outset that potentially could actually be extremely damaging. Because just like the normalization deals were actual achievements, President Trump's recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan is an actual historic achievement. Right? And the fact that the State Department flippantly opens the door toward relitigating that position is incredible.
Can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Sure.
Let's also remember how this came about originally, because it's the same kind of process. Back in 2000, the Security Council demarcated the land border, and the Security Council voted on it unanimously. And this was as part of the process of the Israelis pulling out of Lebanon, and so the Israelis pulled out, and the Security Council determined, as a matter of international law, that Israel had withdrawn from Lebanon because it decided where the blue line was. So
the blue line being the international border,
the international.
Well, it's a temporary. Right, because it hasn't
there's no agreement with the Lebanese
bilateral.
But as far as the UN Security Council is concerned, that's the line.
That would be
that's the line. So now, before Israel withdrew, you'll remember, if you go back to the debates at the time, everyone said, "Oh, the cause of the conflict with Lebanon and with Hezbollah is the Israeli occupation. If you get rid of the occupation, then there's no reason for there to be any conflict." So what did Hezbollah do? Hezbollah invented Sheba farms, and they invented it, right? The Sheba farms is actually in Syrian territory. It's not in Lebanese territory, but the Hezbollah, but because the lines haven't been drawn between Lebanon and Syria in that area, and so on, they can play this game. So they invented it, and there's no people there. And they said, we can't accept, we can't accept Israel or normalization with Israel or relations with Israel because Israel is occupying, and we can't accept the blue line because Israel's occupying Sheba farms. So they invented a pretext. My point about this is that when I was in the White House in 2005 to 2007, we reopened the Sheba farms question. And unfortunately, your Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, he was excited about this and went along with it, and we did it under the idea that we're going to start a negotiation, and the mere fact of negotiating is going to undermine Hezbollah because we're going to take away the pretext from them of Sheba Fars. But they make up pretexts every other day. There's no way we can take that away from them.
That's the key
from them, because the hostility to Israel and the hostility to the United States is fundamental for the organization. But we keep playing this game that it's really about whatever issue Hezbollah is complaining about today.
That's a key point to my mind, that the idea of playing along with this pretext business, which has unfortunately become a deeply entrenched position in the United States among policymakers, that in fact, U.S. policy toward Lebanon is actually predicated on this business, that somehow U.S. policy, the job of U.S. policy is to undercut what it calls Hezbollah's narrative, right?
The narrative war.
Right. If we strip Hezbollah of its argument and pretext and we win the narrative, all of these things, by the way, are like totally real, mind you, right? And I say that sarcastically. That somehow if we take away their argument and their narrative and their pretext, they will just collapse and fall apart. I mean, and then on top of that, you start layering other arguments that build on it, such as the one you mentioned earlier, that, well, if there is prosperity, then also that will undercut their position among the Shia. And then if you layer another one on top of it, if the Lebanese state is then strong and it can defend its own borders, then Hezbollah's arguments will be further weakened. And. So my position is always to say, I will grant you all of that. Please explain to me the next step, the mechanics of what happens next. We have completely undercut all of Hezbollah's arguments. And then what? What happens?
This is the hummus on the beach of Gaza argument in Israel. That when Israel disengaged, the liberals here said, "Oh, you don't understand. The minute that you will be able to eat hummus on the beach in Gaza, they will understand that it's better to do business with us than to fight."
That's right. That's that
is the fundamental idea under this whole process of demarcating the maritime border. It's hummus on the beach of Gaza, again, in a new form. And this argument comes up over and over again in anything to do with Israel and the United States.
I think yesterday the Israeli ambassador to Egypt reiterated this point on American Arabic TV, Al Hurra, said that now the Lebanese will see. We hope for prosperity for Lebanon, and or was it even I'm not sure. Someone in Israel, maybe not her, said something like, now the Lebanese will see that if you collaborate with Israel, there will be prosperity for you, and so on and so forth.
I don't know if it made it to the American news, but there was a whole controversy here in Israel after the explosion in the Beirut port in the summer. The mayor of Tel Aviv lit up the municipal building with the flag of Lebanon, if this can. We think of peace in like almost literary terms here, like it's a mythical state of the end of days with which we can seduce everybody else. I think it was Kissinger that said that only Israel thinks of peace in terms of religious redemption. It's like the end of days. After we arrive there, there is no coming back. It would be, as we say in Hebrew, "Vayagur ze'ev im keves." How would you translate that, Mike?
So the lamb will lie down with the lion.
With the wool. Oh, the lions, it's in Israel. A right-wing Israeli member of parliament once said that that's a very nice vision, but in that vision, I'd rather be the lion.
Right.
So how does it come about in America, Mike? It doesn't sound like Mike Pompeo. It sounds like... No. Barack Obama's administration. Trump, it certainly doesn't sound.
No, it's an American. We have this. Even though Kissinger said that, Kissinger is very un-American in that regard, because we Americans have this this fantasy as well of universal peace, it's very hard to argue to Americans that the way you bring about peace is by having strength and threatening your enemy with annihilation or enormous pain if they do something. I mean, that's not you can make that argument, but if you say that that's the end of it, that there's no, and then their next question is, well, but how do we get to peace with Hezbollah? And you say, you don't.
I can't forget, Mike, this thing that
you don't, and it's not your responsibility.
I can't forget this thing, that short video that you retweeted when there was this, everyone was talking about peaceful demonstrations, and there was this woman with a gun, and these people were coming down the road, and they said, obviously she was a Trump supporter, and they were some, I don't know, Antifa guys, and they said, why are you pointing a gun at us? We're peaceful protesters. And she said, you're peaceful because I'm pointing a gun at you.
That's exactly well, that's right. That's exactly right. That logic is, of course, Americans understand that logic, no problem. But they really want there to be something more, and especially with regard to Israeli-Arab peace. I think because of the biblical associations in the American mind, even for secular Americans. There's still, like, Lincoln talked about the mystic chords of memory. There's still this notion that there's something divine about Israel, even for secular people. And if the United States can play a role in brokering peace between Israelis and Palestinians, or Israelis and Hezbollah, then that's wonderful. And look how much news it gets. There are more important things the United States could do at this time to enhance its position in the Middle East than demarcate the border of right. Lebanon and Israel. But the attraction of the handshake on the White House lawn and of bringing Arabs and Jews together, it has a kind of mythic quality to it. And the State Department especially, there's something in the air in that building. It doesn't matter. You can take the most hard-bitten person and you put them in that building and they start sucking in that air, and they just want to go negotiate Arab-Israeli peace. Look, Tony made a... Tony alluded to the fact that here's another thing that's crazy from the point of view of how you deal with an actor like Hezbollah. The United States has been historically, and when I say historically, over the last decade or so, pressing Israel to make concessions to Lebanon on the maritime border. When you say we are mediating, we are putting our thumb on the scale against Israel. The Israelis are okay with it because they're okay with it because, as the map shows, all of their fields are below the southernmost line. So what the Israelis really want is they just want to get the agreement. If they look at it from a very narrow economic interest, they just want to get the agreement, because then companies will be more comfortable coming in and doing exploration and exploitation if there's an international agreement. But there's no there's more play in the Israeli position than in the Lebanese position. But the Americans are coming in and forcing their ally to make concessions to Hezbollah.
Fundamentally, we treat
this is
both
not
of
how
them.
you do strategy. Yeah.
The reason, okay, so there are 3 points that you raised here that I would like to emphasize because they're very important. First, because there is the reason why all the fundamental premise that leads us to all these problems is that the United States, in its mind, draws a distinction, a false distinction, between Lebanon on the one hand and Hezbollah on the other hand, right? And insofar, and then that mythical non-Hezbollah Lebanon, right, is elevated into a partner and friend of the United States. And Israel is a partner and friend to the United States. So all of a sudden, the United States ignores that little Hezbollah problem and draws an equivalence between an actual ally and a poetic infatuation that the American elite has with Lebanon. That problem is that it confuses and muddies the waters of what constitutes friend and foe, number one, but also what the point of American agreements in the Middle East are about, which brings us back to the normalization deals. We are putting together a camp of US traditional allies vis-a-vis Iran. And we are delineating the line between what are traditional friends and reaffirming commitments that the Obama administration had obliterated in favor of Iran. We are affirming these lines between what constitutes traditional American alliances and Iran on the other side. Lebanon, because of this absurd infatuation and this ridiculous distinction that the US elite drawn entirely from an emotional place, completely turns this thing upside down, because Lebanon, by any objective reality, is in the Iran camp. It's not in ours. We create a mythical distinction to somehow draw Lebanon into a non-Iran camp, which is a failed, which is a bad premise that will have bad repercussions. Third, we have a problem taking us back to the Obama issue. The Obama administration's legacy vis-a-vis Israel were two things. One, the JCPOA and the accompanying UN resolution. The
Iran nuclear deal, as we know it.
Right, the Iran nuclear deal, and the resolution that they sponsored to back it up in the UN. What is it, 2331 or I think, I forgot the number. And then,
sounds right.
And then there is a second UN resolution in the final hours of the Obama administration, which adopted, correct, which adopted the maximalist position on the 67 borders of the Arab states. The 67 borders puts you at odds with Syria and Lebanon on the Golan. The Trump administration came and said, that's finished. It's no longer our position. We destroyed it. The idea that you're relitigating this now on the cusp of an election that might bring back Obama, the team Obama, to the White House, which has not accepted President Trump's position on the Golan, incidentally, is an insane proposition for the State Department to embark on 2 weeks before the election for no value whatsoever. So strategically, it's confused. Even within the confines of its narrow confines of Lebanon policy, it's confused. On the level of Hezbollah policy, it undercuts our position by putting us in some sort of an indirect negotiation, and never mind the funding, future funding or revenues for Hezbollah in Lebanon. And on a very serious set of achievements with regard to the Arab-Israeli conflict arena, that President Trump has made real significant departures from the previous position. All of these things are now flippantly being put back on the table for something that really has no value for U.S. interests whatsoever.
And in terms of the Israeli interest, it's actually missing a chance to bring Hezbollah to its knees is a long-term strategic mistake on the part of Israel. But all this is now up in the air, because what happens if there's a Biden administration, which is an Obama administration? Again.
Well, this is what Tony's saying. They have created a tool, which in their own hands, they're not going to do anything that's going to be that that's going to take us radically out of the framework of the Trump administration. But in the hands of a Biden administration, this will become. They can use these issues in order to reopen the Golan question. They can use it to put pressure on Israel over the maritime border, present Israel as the problem, which the left wants to do. I mean, one of the things that Israel should see as its role is to keep the U.S. vectored on the things that the U.S. does best. What does the U.S. do best? Crush the Iranian economy. Crush Hezbollah economically, right? That's the minute the United States tries to get clever and starts thinking that it's going to go like this and make exciting things happen over here, then it starts to lose the game. And there is, if you talk among the diplomats about this kind of maritime border thing, there are other ideas that are floating around in the atmosphere that this reinforces. For example, the UAE, who is now, of course, the greatest power in the world, Israel's best friend, and Israel is inclined to agree with the UAE about everything. But Israel needs to think twice about the UAE in Syria, because the UAE is pro-Assad in Syria, or at least pro-engagement of Assad. And they're selling the idea that we can build up an Arab pole and pull Assad away from Iran. Will Assad become totally, anti-Iranian? No, he won't flip like Egypt flipped after Camp David. But we can create a Saudi, UAE, Israel pole, and we'll pull Assad in the direction of that pole, and thereby create friction between Damascus and Tehran, maybe even between Damascus and Hezbollah, and so on. These ideas, these clever ideas, which they keep coming back up every couple of years in Washington.
Decades.
All the time. They come back all the time. Each time it's in a different form. Well, we're trying to drive a wedge or create tension between Damascus and Tehran, or between Hezbollah and Tehran, because Hezbollah is actually a Lebanese militia. It's not really just an arm of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, and so on. And all of these ideas never lead anywhere. The tension never emerges. But what they do is they undercut the priority of the United States, which is to smash the economy of revolutionary Iran and its allies like Hezbollah. That's what the United States is very good at. It doesn't take a lot of thought. I mean, it does take a certain amount of thought up front, but once you figure out how to do it, you just push the button and you make it happen. But then you have to stay the course, because all the clever people come to you with all of these schemes to explain how we can create a better world if we engage with that one and put money in the pocket of that one, and so on. And the Israeli answer to all of this should be, we demarcated the border in 2000. When you are ready, Hezbollah, to accept what the UN Security Council unanimously agreed, then we'll sit down with you. We got the Golan from the Americans. When the Americans start to talk about changing the border, we should say to the Americans, no, we agree with President Trump. The Golan is Israeli. We're not going to get in any process that's even hints at the possibility that it might be something else.
So to go back to my brooding, all this is not going to be very relevant if there's a Biden administration, right? This is all going to go, all Trump has built in 4 years is just going to collapse back to the Edward Said paradigm, and we're going.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that, first of all, he has put things in Israel's pocket that Israel's not going to just simply give up. And it's going to be very hard for an American Congress, even a Congress dominated by Democrats, to get behind the idea of making Israel give it up, moving the capital out of Jerusalem or whatever. I think even if they wanted to have that political fight, it doesn't make sense to me that they would. But even if they did, I think it would be very easy to make it revert back, in a couple of years' time. Same thing with the Golan, and hopefully the Trump with the Kushner plan and with regard to Israelis and Palestinians, because of the success that it immediately generated with the UAE and Bahrain and maybe others as well, I think that has established itself as an alternative way of dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian question. It won't be the way that the Biden administration will adopt, but it's now out there as a legitimate pathway that the United States can go down.
So no one is going to say again, like John Kerry, no, and no. You remember that?
Right.
You can't solve the problem unless you start with the Palestinians. But Tony,
it's been disproved.
Since we have you here, and we are all, I think, very anxious about the results in Israel, about the results of the coming elections in America. What's your general prediction of what the Middle East would look like in the unfortunate event of a Biden administration?
It's unclear. I do agree with Mike that the Trump administration has made such important like milestones, really, and laid down several markers that are going to be very difficult to reverse. However, it's not a secret that the a Biden administration, as they have said, that they want to return to the JCPOA format, to the Iran deal format. Yes, with possible modifications, improvements, addenda, and so on, but basically to return to that framework. Whether it will immediately lead to a lifting of sanctions or easing of sanctions remains to be seen. I mean, there are people who say that no, the Biden administration now understands that there's a usefulness for the sanctions. Perhaps, but there are also other ways around it, under humanitarian pretexts, under all kinds of pretexts that could lead to some form of relaxation, if not on the part of the United States, then maybe on the part of the Europeans, and so on. So there's a lot of uncertainty in this regard. And I guess if you're Hezbollah, you don't have much of a choice but to bank on the uncertainty. With the Trump administration, that's where you are, right? We don't know if Biden is going to lift sanctions, maybe not immediately, maybe not entirely, but the fact that there is a possibility that may happen makes their gambit very clear, right? Which is why they delayed these talks until like the first 2 weeks before the elections, right? And then we'll see. They did the same thing with the French initiative, right? The French wanted a government in Lebanon in September. Said, yeah, okay, sure. It's not going to happen. We're going to wait, and we're going to see. We're going to see what happens in Washington. If a Biden administration emerges, we'll wait some more and see what its position is going to be on Iran, how far they're going to go either in continuing with the Trump approach or how far they're going to depart from the Trump approach. All of these things then become reshuffled, right? But there are now milestones. You see, we have set up a camp of Arab states that have normalized relations with Israel. More are coming. We have set up a bunch of laws in Congress with regard to sanctions. We have set up a real, marker of the effectiveness of sanctions on the Iranians, so on and so forth. I think there's going to be a battle. I think anyone who says that the Biden administration, entirely understands that the Trump approach bears fruit is not really listening to what a lot of voices in that team, which is the same team that was under Obama, really, their position and the importance of the Iran deal legacy for them. The importance of making sure that legacy is vindicated, because that's Obama's legacy, right? So I think the pull of doing that, of trying to reestablish ties with Iran, of showing that this is the real way forward, that you have to have an agreement with Iran, is going to be very strong. And so the balance is going to be interesting to see.
And they're also very ideological. It's the Obama paradigm it's for me. I don't call it the Obama doctrine. I call it the Edward Said doctrine, because I think that it rests on a moral ritual of cleansing, in which you have to accommodate the radicals, right, because the radicals are right, because essentially the radicals are right, and this is, once we used to think, when I was studying in America, we used to think, that Judith Butler is crazy for saying that Hezbollah and Hamas are the vanguard of progressivism. And so these people are absolutely crazy. And then came a president, which we didn't realize how ideological, and we should have by the time he gave the Cairo speech, which completely thinks of history in mythological and moral terms. So my guess is that we're going to see a quicker return to the arms of Iran than we imagine. I hope I'm wrong.
No, I think it's definitely going to happen. Also, it's going to be a return to the arms of Europe. I mean, this is the number one request of Europe when Biden meets with the French, the Germans, and even the British, unfortunately, is going to be a return to the JCPOA. It's the one thing that they all agree on. All the Europeans. I mean, there's so much disagreement among the Europeans, but they all agree on that, and they're all making the same demand of America. So this is an opportunity for Biden to come together with the Europeans, and to him, it's a way of saying to the American public, I have left the conflictual, difficult path of Donald Trump for the path of working with my allies toward peace.
Correct.
And that's psychologically and politically, that's huge.
Final word from each of you. What would you advise Israel to do? Suppose this American view, we're unable to decide for America, unfortunately. What should Israel do? Suppose you are completely released from any constraints and any obligations. What would you do if you were the Israeli side on this poker table? Tony?
With regard to Lebanon, or more broadly?
Lebanon, yeah.
Oh, with Lebanon, I would, now that the United States has begun this process, I would say that if by the next session there is no immediate move towards a clear agreement, that they would ask the United States to stop this, and second, that they demand that the State Department at the highest level issue a statement reaffirming the U.S. position that the Shebaa Farms is part of the Golan Heights, and and reaffirming Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, so that the American position on this issue is quite clear. That this is not, that we don't want this whole business with the land border demarcation to reopen this whole can of worms. And third, I would say that Israel should redouble its efforts to get the United States to defund and disentangle itself and defund or veto the renewal of UNIFIL in Lebanon. Just end that whole situation. Those are on tactical, sort of tactical and semi-strategic grounds, basically for Israel. And most importantly, I would continue the push to dissuade the United States from continuing to view Lebanon and Hezbollah as two distinct entities, and showcase how this distinction is leading the U.S. down a rabbit hole of other fake distinctions that reinforce those voices in Europe that posit a political wing versus a military wing. That the United States should abandon all of this and focus on the prize, which is how to contain Iran in the region, and Lebanon does not fit in that camp of pro-containment.
Mike?
I agree with all that, and that last point is the most important one. That the job of Israel is to keep the United States focused on its policy of maximum pressure. That Iran is the strategic, defeating the Islamic Republic is the strategic goal of the United States. That's the thing that Israel needs most from the United States. The purpose of the United States, from Israel's point of view, is to deter Russia and deter Iran. And if you want, I don't believe this, but from one of our previous conversations, deter Turkey. I don't think that's I think that's a mistake. That's part of the reason why I argue about this Turkey stuff with Israelis and with pro-Israelis in Washington, is that the Turkey thing right now is the biggest distraction from it's even bigger than the maritime border, but it's the biggest distraction from what the role of the United States should be, which is maximum pressure on Iran 24/7. Every conversation that Bibi Netanyahu has with Trump should be, Mr. President, tell me about maximum pressure today. Maximum pressure, maximum pressure, maximum pressure. And the journalist Amit Segal said something. How did you say his name? Segal? You say
Segal.
Segal. Amit Segal said something clever after the Kushner plan came out. He was very excited about it, and he said, in the past, we made concessions and we got words in return. This turns it all around. They make concessions and we give words, right? That should be the Israeli position on every border conflict, right? They make concessions, we give words, right? So the system where because they sit down and talk to us, we start agreeing to open up questions that have long been closed and so on.
Mike, because nonsense. Remember, we were the not just the unpopular kid in class, we were the boycotted kid in class, and so we were just so grateful that someone was willing to talk to us. So the whole thing was around any like small gesture. Had they made what was once with China ping pong diplomacy, we would have been in their arms. And incidentally, when Sadat made the bold move of coming to Jerusalem, Israelis fell in love. It was romantic. It was unbelievably emotional. Well, I hope you guys will have time to reconvene after the election, and I hope we would not be having a sad obituary session to all that we discussed today, but I'm sure we'll have much to talk about. So thank you both for your time, and let's reconvene in about a month. What do you say?
Fine by me. That'll be great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.